Good afternoon. So today we're covering an argumentative assignment on the civil rights movement. All right. I don't know how many of you have had an opportunity yet to look over it, but we're going to right now. All right. So sharing with this, the civil rights, those are the questions, which is fine. I plan to look over those as well. I want to look over the actual assignment. All right, so with the civil rights movement, right, largely in the 1950s and 1960s, you have a popular push for just that, to equalize the system of the allocation of civic rights to all demographics, demographics that had been discriminated against, marginalized, like African Americans. Much of the salient material that you cover on the civil rights movement is you'll find with the African American movement, Hispanic Americans, known as the Chicano movement, the feminist movement, Native Americans, Asian Americans as well. But I tend to focus on the first two here on this assignment, and I beg your pardon for that. But with number one, right, is that there seemed to have been a generational and somewhat of a philosophical difference, a distinction between those who were for direct action. They tended to be younger, more idealistic. I mean, let's face it, in some ways a little bit more bold. And then you had more of the old school from the early 1900s, those who were members of LULAC, the League of United Latin American Citizens, and the NAACP, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. And the latter group, right, who tended to be older, were constituted in the first 2 decades of the 1900s. What they wanted to do is they wanted to rely upon the law. They wanted to rely upon changing precedent in the courts, right? So Sweat versus Painter, the famous Montgomery bus boycott decision, the Morgan case with busing, and of course the most famous was the 54-55 Topeka, Kansas case on public schools, right? And so at any rate, with number one, the argument is that latter group did a fine job. All right, there's no getting around it. Fighting injustice in the courts was respectable. It was partially successful in some of the cases. So you could Google, civil rights, famous civil rights cases, and you'll come across a pretty decent list of cases, right? But the problem is, right, is that case after case, like when colleges and schools were integrated, there was widespread popular white defiance toward those decisions, where especially right in the famous Brown versus Board of Education case in Kansas, they said that it was to be implemented with all deliberate speed, kind of a vague term. So, I mean, you had Governor Orville Faubus of Arkansas, you had Governor George Wallace of Alabama, who outright said they were not going to abide by the decision, and they were not going to allow Black students to come into their schools. And so you had to have all this fuss over brave individuals like James Meredith and the Little Rock Nine in Arkansas go to school and have a racist governor turn his state militia against them and use their guns to deter these Black kids from going into the school. And then you had to have a federal power struggle in which the executive of the country, right, usually under the Department of Justice, came and stepped in and said no and reversed it and nationalized the state militia and forced those same troops to who had once, been there to deter the Black kids from coming into class. Now they were to chaperone them and protect them. It's kind of a cool case. as with the Little Rock Nine and James Meredith in Mississippi. So no doubt you have some very landmark cases that were accomplished and won. But as you see in those few examples, people challenged it. It took an extra step. It took African Americans actually going to those schools to try to force that integration. And likewise with the buses, long after the Morgan decision to desegregate public busing. So at any rate, the point being, right, is that those who were for direct action were necessary and arguably more effective than the NAACP and LULAC in winning those cases in the courts, in forcing the country to have discourse on the topic, as if the decisions weren't enough. Them taking it to the streets, so to speak, is what really forced the country to come to terms with this injustice of racial discrimination. So, for instance, the arguably one of, if not the most famous, large numerically, tons of publicity. You know, you have ABC, NBC, Life magazine, Time magazine. They're covering all this stuff. And so you have SNCC, Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, largely run by Bob Moses, with college students and professors, etc. What they largely adhere to were the teachings of Mohandas Gandhi and of Jesus Christ. And what they contended, right, was the idea of nonviolent civil disobedience. And you're probably familiar with the term. Henry David Thoreau had written about it just prior to the Civil War. But the notion, right, that in the universe, there are moral absolutes of right and wrong and justice and so forth. And that sometimes civic laws, man-made laws, get it right, and sometimes they get it wrong. And so in a case where a man-made law goes against a divine, higher, universal law, you are in good conscience to confront the authorities in deliberately disobeying that civic law that goes against the higher law, right? So in this case, it's segregating Black and white people, not allowing African Americans to eat in restaurants, to sit in the front of the bus, etc. So they would go to the institution and they would confront them, right? And then what they were supposed to use was soul force, as Mahatma Gandhi articulated, is that they were to demonstrate the righteousness of their cause through a willingness to suffer and to keep the high road, if you will. Because what the notion was is the underlying hopes of this movement is that mankind is not inherently evil, mankind is not inherently hateful, but that much hate, much discrimination has been taught by nurture rather than nature. And so what can be learned can be, quote, unlearned, right? And so hence there was hope in the oppressor, hope that the oppressor could change his ways, could be shamed into change. And so what you do is you confront the oppressor, knowing full well the intricate, just gargantuan ability of human beings to rationalize what they do. So they knew that when they went to a whites only lunch counter, that in moments, the person wasn't going to say, you know what, you guys are human beings. I guess I'll give you a hamburger. I'll serve you a hamburger and a milkshake as well. They knew it wouldn't be that easy. They knew that defense mechanisms are a part of the oppressor's justification for what he does. And so they knew that they would elicit immediately a very defensive, a very even violent mode of behavior from their oppressor. And that's exactly what happened, right? Case after case after case. I think of the Greensboro boys, 4 freshmen African Americans in North Carolina in 1960, went to a Woolworth's lunch counter for whites only, asking to be served. They poured milkshakes on their head. They spit on them. They called them awful things. But on the third day, they began to accrue a crowd of white people chanting for them. A woman came and patted one on the back and said, "You boys should have done this a long time ago." And before you know it, they started polarizing the community between those who thought, who are these troublemakers? They know they can't be served there. They're just provoking trouble. And those who said, you know what, this is right. This is morally right. It's about time that someone take such a stance. And so that's exactly what this philosophy entails, is that you're trying to use soul force to win over your oppressors. And the idea is that with the oppressor, it's going to be arguably more difficult because no one ostensibly goes to bed saying, I'm an evil person, what I do is unethical, etc., when he or she goes to sleep. But we have a very intricate ability to rationalize what we do, right? So it's going to take time to win over the oppressors. But more immediately is you were to win over the rest of the people, right? People that are living their daily lives that the Romans would call tending your own garden, just raising your children, going to school, going to work, enjoying your family life and your social relations. And oftentimes, perhaps your day-to-day interactions, you never even meet with an African American, much less, abuse one. And so hence the idea is to get those people out of their slumber. That's the term that Martin Luther King used, that most white Americans were just simply slumbering. And so that's when the role of the cameras come in. You bring in the television cameras, you bring in and invite the press, and you let them show this stuff for everyone to see when they go to sit down to eat dinner, right? Their TV dinners. And they turn on the television and they see stuff like Birmingham and Selma and St. Augustine. Have any of you seen footage from Birmingham with the fire hoses and the dogs, etc.? See, if we had class, I put this on here, the attachment, but this is on my rendition of it. If someone will remind me, I'll be happy to put the attachment, post it on Canvas. If you'd like to take a look at this Birmingham footage, it's very moving. It's very hard for it not to have a very visceral, emotional response elicited from you and watching it. Just these people, right? And for another thing, right, is oftentimes, whether you're Christian or not, when they would come into these institutions and so forth, they would pray, they would sing hymnals, they would read from scripture, etc. And no one likes to feel like they're playing the role of the devil, right, against these peaceful people being religious, and then here you are thumping heads and sicking dogs on them, etc. And so at any rate, it's very moving. I'll post it for you guys, some Birmingham footage. But anyway, that's what the people saw. And it's to elicit within a sense of compassion and a sense of indignation. And from your religious studies, remember, indignation is righteous anger. It's something that you ought to be angry with, okay? And so that's what they're trying to elicit, these nonviolent, civil disobedient protesters. So they went into whites-only restaurants, bus stations, public swimming pools, you name it. And it elicited a lot of a myriad of reactions from the people, all right? But the point being, on number 2, is that even if it did, which of course it did, elicit somewhat of immediate white backlash, right? A gentleman, when President Lyndon B. Johnson was trying to get Congress to pass civil rights legislation, he contended, he said, haven't you looked at the Gallup polls? Most Americans are growing weary of these protests. They're thinking that they're tired of seeing heads bashed, that they almost see them as sadomasochistic martyrs, and they don't want to see it anymore, and they want it to stop. But at the same time, right? Look at some of these things. NBC aired a 3-hour special on American Revolution of '63, in which the correspondents noting the March on Washington with King's famous "I Have a Dream" speech, that his kids would be treated by the content of their character rather than by the color of their skin, and white violence upon peaceful protesters was creating a revolution, that it was creating a agitation for change, agitation for some type of legislation, right? Look at this. Racial issues, claim the U.S. News and World Report, have moved out in the front in people's thoughts. The government counted 758 copycat racial demonstrations following Birmingham in 186 different American cities. So it was catching like fire. All right. So the point being here is, number one is in praise of the nonviolent civil disobedience tactic and contending that it was useful, it was effective, it was necessary, right? To jar Americans out of their apathy or out of their slumber, to generate a sense of indignation and popular commiseration for the plight of Black Americans, and also to convince the government, as well as those putting pressure on government, that something needs to change, something needs to improve, that the status quo is not tolerable. All right, so any questions on number one? The Mexican-American counterpart to this was Mayo, the Mexican-American Youth Organization. And if you wanted to look up a big name, a guy named Jose Angel Gutierrez was really big in politically organizing Hispanics, especially in Texas, in southern Texas, and getting them to engage in nonviolent civil disobedience and registering them to vote, etc. There's a really good PBS video on the Chicano movement, if you wanted to look that up. Number two is Great Man History. Very simple thesis. Just states that the civil rights movement may not have accrued the momentum and the timing that it did had it not been for key individuals and their behavior and their actions and their courage and their audacity. So Irene Morgan and Rosa Parks, boy, they started something, right? And each in turn refused to give her seat to a white man on a bus in the South. Dr. Martin Luther King. This guy was on all the main magazine covers at one point or another, received probably more publicity than any civil rights leader, period, during this movement. A great, great orator. Just watch some of the videos of some of his speeches. And not just a great orator, but he seemed to serve as a good bridge. So to the Nation of Islam, right? He contended that there is an inherent goodness in white people, that much of their racism has been learned and, quote, can be unlearned, that there is hope for integration, for Black and white to live together harmoniously, and that violence is never the answer. So by and large, the white public loved to hear that. That was somewhat conciliatory, right? But at the same time, he also stated that this movement was not meant to make America feel comfortable. That's the whole root of it, right? Is to make America feel uncomfortable enough to do something to effect change. That his people, that African-American people, were suffering grave injustices that need to be rectified as soon as possible. He had connections with academia as a student himself. He had connections with a lot of very powerful Jewish rabbis who were part of the nonviolent civil disobedience school of thought. He branched out to a lot of different demographics and institutions and made a lot of allies. And he made allies in government as well as enemies. Arguably the most famous enemy, right, was J. Edgar Hoover of the FBI, who was paranoid that he was too soft on communism and that he was an agitator and had his phones bugged, etc., and threatened him on multiple occasions. But he also was invited to the White House countless times when they were debating legislation for civil rights improvements. They went to him for advice. So much so that Malcolm X is going to call Dr. Martin Luther King an Uncle Tom. But he was a big kind of crossover figure. When he called members of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, their main avenues were arguably were collaborating with the NAACP in fighting court cases and drawing publicity to injustices everywhere. And they were very adept at the boycott as a tool, right? So if a busing company refused to allow Black passengers to sit where they like, then they would boycott that bus. And then there were occasions where SNCC, the Young College-Oriented Organization, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee that was really on the streets, taking it to the streets with sit-ins, etc. They have a famous chant where they said, "King, where is your body? We know you're giving great speeches, but we want your body present." So therefore, at Birmingham, at Selma, at St. Augustine, Florida, he showed up and was arrested with the rest of them. So he was willing to walk the walk as well. So much so that some people began to stop endorsing him politically because he had been arrested so many times. So this man of many trades seemed to have a cohesive effect on multiple organizations of the civil rights movement. CORE, SNCC, SCLC, they all collaborated with him. And he was a good spokesman for the cause. Then Bayard Rustin, Jim Peck, guy named Jim Farmer. Look up these individuals and see how they were just, I mean, what does it say of Jim Farmer? It says here that when he spoke, people listened, engaged in dialogue, or I can't read that word, and read about it or watched it via the press. His oratorical skills predated Martin Luther King, and his no-nonsense, manly, confrontational nature and methods predated Malcolm X. There was a quote I thought I'd put under here where he is described as like a one-man. Oh, no, I'm sorry. That's Bayard Rustin right here. Functioned as a one-man civil disobedience movement in his travels across the U.S. That's Bayard Rustin. They organized. They enlisted thousands of white volunteers to help. So that's Jim Peck, that's Jim Farmer, that's Bayard Rustin. Of course, that's King. Those are the Greensboro boys. This is Cesar Chavez and Dolores Huerta of the farm working movement. That's Jose Angel Gutierrez, instrumental in Crystal City, Texas, and throughout the state. And this is Rodolfo, or known as Corky Gonzalez, who wrote the famous poem and was in charge of the convention that created the Mexican-American third party, La Raza Unida. And this girl is part of the Little Rock Nine, who showed up to the Central Valley High School in Little Rock, Arkansas, after the Brown versus the Board decision. And you can see from the faces of the women around her, the hatred that she incurred. All right. So if you look at some of the stuff they did, their organizational skills, the Freedom Rides, right, by CORE, Congress on Racial Equality, in 1961, did a huge freedom ride of black and white passengers sitting side by side throughout the South. They didn't make it to a single final destination, any of the buses. Some of them were brutalized until the federal government under John F. Kennedy stepped in to protect them. But they're forcing discourse on the subject. They're forcing America to take notice of this injustice, of this problem, right? So arguably, things could have evolved much more slowly had it not been for these key individuals. And that's all I'm arguing on number 2. Number 3 is very subjective. All right. This is another one where I kind of wrote with tongue in cheek. All right. Not necessarily even something that I believe, but I thought it was interesting having read it. Is that the more militant organizations like the Nation of Islam, the Black Panthers, they served a positive role in applying pressure to the governments, state and federal, to bring about change. That, yeah, you may not stand by their platform. So with the Nation of Islam under Elijah Muhammad, they literally put into their doctrine, into their Muslim doctrine, the belief that white people literally have emanated biologically, historically, religiously, from the devil himself. So hence the term white devil. So hence they did not want integration. They wanted to stay separate. And so, I mean, you see this all the way up through, and you see the transitions of that with Malcolm X's conversion when he went to Mecca, trying to balancing this old school way of looking at it with Louis Farrakhan later on. But nevertheless, they armed themselves. They had a paramilitary organization. They were for earning the right to a subsidized trip back to Africa, and in the meantime, complete safety and also economic remuneration, going back from the times of slavery, from the federal government, and protecting themselves, even if by violence. So you have the famous Stokely case, Stokely, that you could look up in Southern California, where Muslims were done with religious services late at night, and they were selling clothing out of the back of their cars, and cops were very wary of them to begin with, and them selling something out of the back of their cars at night seemed even more suspicious. So they stopped them, and words and forceful physical pushing around was initiated by the cops, and the Muslims fought back. And a gentleman named Stokely was killed, and it got a lot of publicity, the Stokely case. And Malcolm X spoke in defense, even though he initially was under Elijah Muhammad in Harlem, New York, under Mosque number 7. He traveled to California to defend the Muslims at this Muslim chapter, and to show how this was emblematic of how necessary it was for African American men to hold their own, to protect themselves. And on that case as well, I find it very interesting is if you look up Freedom Summer of '64 in Mississippi, you have people like Stokely Carmichael, who during the day, when they went on their sit-ins, etc., they adhered to discipline, because they were trained at the colleges and other facilities. They had people spray things in their face, punch and slap them, spit on them, try to provoke them verbally. And if you couldn't pass the test, they wouldn't allow you to go and protest, because that was key to nonviolent civil disobedience, right? Is you don't retaliate. You try to shame your oppressor into changing. And so at any rate, they adhered to that during the day. But at night, when thousands of them were making these makeshift camps and staying in these little cottages, in some cases even in their cars, throughout that summer of '64 in Mississippi, they began to get attacked by the local KKK. And Stokely Carmichael and others began showing a little bit of a wavering and saying, you know what, maybe I was a little bit naive about this nonviolent civil disobedience, especially when it comes to my kids, because some of them had brought their wives and kids down there. So they made that differentiation and saying, if it's just me and I'm in a whites only lunch counter, I'll incur whatever abuse comes without retaliating. But if they come to where I'm staying at night and they try to attack, the Klan tries to attack my children, then I have a gun and I'm willing to use it to protect myself. I just find that a fascinating topic. So at any rate, with the Nation of Islam, they made no bones about it. They did not want to integrate. They advocated or supported the use of violence in self-defense. But you might make the argument that Huey Newton, Bobby Seale, and the Black Panthers took it even arguably another step. Is what they contended, right? Is they contended that they literally, like in their terms and in the legality of how they thought their rights worked, etc., is that they literally in Oakland, the Black people in Oakland in the East Bay were a conquered people by a conquering country. And the white police were no different from foreign tanks coming into their environment as an instrument of their oppression. So they armed themselves, they roamed in their cars, and they actually followed cops who would pull over young Black men. And on occasion, they had like a loudspeaker, and they would begin questioning the officer. They knew the law codes of California very well, and they would stick up for the person being pulled over. And then in a couple very controversial episodes, they actually got in a gunfight with the cops. The FBI is going to give its okay to a counterintelligence program, and they put the Black Panthers up at the top of the list of public enemies. On more than one occasion, they had assassin teams to kill Bobby Seale. It got crazy, where in a few cases they had shootouts in Oakland. And the Black Panthers issued a 10-point program. Take a look at it. We want freedom. We want power to determine the destiny of our Black community. So they wanted autonomy. They wanted regional autonomy in the federal government and the local state and the state police and so forth, to let them be. We want full employment for our people. We want an end to the robbery by the white man of our Black community. We want decent housing fit for shelter of human beings. We want education for our people that exposes the true nature of this decadent American society. They embraced a lot of Marxism, right? Where the winners, the wealthy, were a plutocratic, villainous cadre that was ruling at the expense of everybody else, especially Black men. We want education that teaches us our true history and our role in the present day society. We want all Black men to be exempt from military service. We want an immediate end to police brutality and murder of Black people. We want freedom for all Black men held in federal, state, county, and city prisons and jails. We want all Black people, when brought to trial, to be tried in court by a jury of their peer group or people from their Black communities, as defined by the Constitution. We want land, bread, housing, education, clothing, justice, and peace. So at any rate, a lot of the basic information on the civil rights movement, because boy, it's big, could be found in basic books. I mean, basic because they're not specializing in one facet of it, like this New York Times bestseller by Taylor Branch, Pillar of Fire. I learned a lot of the basics from that. But the next thing I'm going to say was largely quoted from this book right here, Doris Kearns Goodwin, Lyndon Johnson and the American Dream. You have quotes in this book, right? And paraphrasing, that contend that increasingly Lyndon B. Johnson, in trying to convince Congress to pass legislation for civil rights for African Americans especially, right? That in pushing for it, he increasingly brought their attention to organizations like the Black Panthers, the Nation of Islam, the Watts riots, and contended, we either feed them some crumbs off the table or they're going to set our own house on fire. So hence my point on number 3 is that civil disobedience was beautiful. It's something that people for generations can desire to emulate, can praise. I would even say that civil disobedience was limitedly effective. in awakening a lot of white Americans from their slumber, right, of tending their own garden, from, in some rare cases, eliciting the shame of their very oppressors, who ended up changing their platform, but that it did not work with everyone. Some people, right, you turn your cheek to them, they're more than happy to hit the other cheek and continue to do so ad nauseum without any shame. But that there was room in some instances with a certain portion of the American society, and also perhaps with a lot of racist Democratic Party and Republican Party, for that matter, Southerners in Congress, that there was room for a need for these types of militant groups, because they were not being won over by Martin Luther King, to literally become afraid that fear can be a catalyst just like love can be. And that some Americans needed to become a little bit afraid to acquiesce to civil rights legislation. So it's pretty cynical. It's very subjective. But I had read it in a book and I thought it was a very thought-provoking thesis. All right, so any questions on number 3? All right. Number 4 is structural history of the civil rights movement, as opposed to great man history. Remember, what we're talking about here is causation. When you get into the subjective argument of what caused an event to happen. Number 2 says it was people. It was key individuals that got the ball rolling, right? Number 4 says, no, it's structural history. It was structures. It was things bigger than any individual that helped the civil rights movement to develop when it did. And namely, the structural interpretation revolves around World War II and the Cold War. World War II, in the Atlantic Charter, we made it clear to the world that we were the good guys against fascism because we're fighting for the human dignity and rights of all human beings. But yet we were segregating our soldiers. There was a guy named Felix Longoria who was killed in the Pacific, a Mexican-American from Texas. And when his body was brought back home, they refused to inter him in the local military cemetery simply because he was Hispanic. And it got lots of publicity. You had the infamous Zoot Suit riots. Started with bad press on a new cultural movement amongst Mexican-American adolescents and youngsters in the LA area. They developed the term Pachuco to describe them. And they had their own dress, the Zoot Suit, their own hairstyle that kind of differentiated them, kind of like the flapper had its own symbol of iconography and a symbol of fashion. And a young man labeled as a Pachuco broke the jaw of a U.S. Navy private in a skirmish over a girl. The naval guy returned to his ship. Others found out about his having his jaw broken by a Pachuco. And before you know it, over 1,000 armed servicemen, some coming from as far as Las Vegas, came into the streets of LA to look for Mexican Americans to beat up. And it literally constituted a riot. And the armed forces had to step in. Look up the Rapido River in Italy. You have cases of Mexican Americans contending that they were forced to cross the Rapido River, which was virtually a suicide mission. And they deliberately put Mexican Americans in the lead to do it. So the point being, right, and you look at the plight of African American young women who went to Richmond and Oakland and worked in the Kaiser shipyards, and look at the treatment they incurred at the local restaurants and hotels and areas. So hence that World War II, it highlighted the hypocrisy of American rhetoric. It highlighted that we were not practicing what we preached. And it raised expectations, especially for young men who fought and risked their lives for the red, white, and blue flag by the time they had come home. Then you add to that the war boom, the war economic boom. You could find it in Alan Brinkley's textbook. Government spending on military empowerment helped arguably the entire economy. You add to that the GI Bill that granted a subsidized college education for all veterans, including Hispanic and Black. So now they're having a subsidized college education when they come back. And you add to that the FHA, right? And providing government subsidized loans to own a house, to purchase a house. And what do you get? You get the development of a Black and brown middle class by the mid-1950s. And they've done experiments like this, guys, in psychology and sociology, whereby they will put, and shame on me for not having an exact name of a case study, but I know I've read through it before, where they deliberately put them in a position where there is an injustice done to them. And it could be something as simple as, going to a movie theater and unbeknownst to them that they're being tested or tried as a guinea pig, they are extorted for more money than they ought to have to pay. And they were looking for patterns of responses. And they were looking for those who tended to stand their ground and demand their rights, right? Versus those who fatalistically just deferred and said, fine, you're in charge. And they just took the injustice in the chin. They were looking to see if there was any correlation between those two groups. And supposedly what they found is those who overwhelmingly demanded justice and stood their ground had education, had more education than those who didn't, who just took it. So there might be something there, right? And there might be a tie that you look up, some of the people I mentioned, Bob Moses, Martin Luther King, Jose Angel Gutierrez. These were highly educated people doing grad study work long after their bachelor's. They had read and studied Gandhi and works on civil disobedience and protests in school and were moved by it. So hence World War II developed a fertile soil for the civil rights movement to occur, according to number 4. And then not to mention the Cold War is by the 50s, North Africa, Asia, and other areas around the world began decolonizing these countries that had been colonized by European bullies for decades or even centuries, began fighting for and earning their independence as new sovereign countries. And we began to call upon these new decolonized independent countries to join NATO, to join CETO, as it was called, and other military and diplomatic alliances that we were making against the Soviet Union. Well, the Soviet Union called us out on that and basically told these countries, don't be fooled by the United States. They won't think anything of you as their ally. Look how they treat the people of color in their own country. And shortly after the Soviet Union called us out on that, Harry Truman desegregated our armed forces. And to a lot of people, that was no coincidence. That in light of the Cold War, image was important. All right. So that's known as a structural interpretation as to why the civil rights movement happened when it did. So are there any questions?
So on question 3,
Yes, sir.
could you give me some more information about President Kennedy and 63, the year 63?
President Kennedy. Oh, and the Civil Rights Act of 64. Yeah. See, all I did there, right, is I put in the wrong president. Kennedy was killed November 22nd of 63. And a lot of people contend that he was not capable of muscling through the civil rights acts that occurred after his death. That Lyndon B. Johnson had the unique personality and had the political gifts alone to make that happen. So yeah, I deliberately put in the wrong president there. Kennedy took a stand with the somewhat of a stand with the Freedom Riders, the core Freedom Riders. He gave a great announcement to the country about the ugliness of racial discrimination, asking white Americans to put themselves in the shoes of a Black American and to see if this would be a country they'd want to live in. He initiated civil rights committees, quite a few of them. Told Martin Luther King that he had some ideas, he and his brother, on civil rights legislation that they wanted Congress to pass. But we'll never know how that would have gone because he was killed. But in comes Lyndon B. Johnson, and the Johnson treatment that you find on number 7 is absolutely famously true as far as the popular depictions of him as a president. He would have literally almost what I would consider spies would write up information on every congressman, their family life, what they were going through that might become, discernible, where they had stood on what issues in the past, what they were pushing for currently. And he would either, or both, he would call them into committees. And sometimes it was just 3 men. And there were a lot of congressmen. And so you can imagine the time employed in this, just 3 at a time. And he would have these briefings with them. And he would say, how are your grandkids? He knew the names of the grandkids. How's everything going in your life? And he would try to butter them up. So I see you're trying to get a bridge built in your congressional district, Mr. So-and-so. Or I see that you're pushing for that, Mr. So-and-so. Well, what if I told you that I could help make that happen? I have this congressman and that congressman who owe me, who said they'd be willing to put forth pork barrel legislation. Remember, pork barrel legislation is you have a law that is ostensibly about one single topic, and then in the fine print, you put lots of other addendums added to it. So it could literally be a civil rights law, and at the bottom of it, it'll say a bridge is to be built in Alabama. So he really utilized pork barrel legislation and trying to get as much is trying to, quid pro quo. You scratch my back, I scratch yours. But they contended that when they, and he also referred to their vanity oftentimes and would tell them, you do realize, right, that future generations are going to hold us as the most famous and successful Congress in American history. We're going to pass more meaningful legislation, he said, than our predecessors did during Reconstruction. And so he had that sense of destiny as well. Some people say he was his ego was involved, that he had a myriad of motives, some not so pure, in trying to pass this stuff. One being that he was trying to outdo Kennedy, even after Kennedy had died. And there definitely was a sense of prideful rivalry between the two. Some even go so far as say he was trying to impress his mother. He had sadly mother issues and was constantly asking his secretary if she thought his mother was proud of him for everything that was being passed. I kid you not. So for a myriad of mixed motives, he became like a wrecking ball in through Congress and trying to cajole them into passing this legislation. And when they said no, when they became recalcitrant, that's when he began threatening and telling them all the connections he had, how he could make their life more difficult, et cetera, et cetera. So collectively, I think the term's even mentioned in our textbook. It was called the Johnson treatment. And then you see number 6, which is the following does not match up regarding the Chicano movement. Crystal City, Texas, arguably afforded a lesson in respecting Hispanic voting influence and collective action. Absolutely. If you watch the PBS video on the Chicano movement, absolutely. They had drives to get voters registered. Then they put a poll tax out, knowing that the Mexican people were poor. So they had all kinds of fundraisers to pay each voter to be able to pay his or her poll tax. And the local elections came in as a voting bloc. The Hispanics pushed out the old guard from the city council and the school board and voted in almost all Hispanics. And it was known as the Cristal movement or Crystal City movement. And collective action, their famous December 9th walkouts of the schools, because they wanted Chicano studies. They wanted more Mexican-American teachers. They wanted them to stop grading the kids their freshman year and deciding whom to put into workshop classes and other vocational oriented classes, and who they decided to put in the college prep classes, because it would seem to be dividing on ethnic lines. So they put an end to that. They're fascinating if you have time to look into these PBS videos. B, Rodolfo Gonzalez greatly contributed to Mexican-American consciousness, identity, and unity via his famous Yo Soy Joaquin, I Am Joaquin poem. Absolutely. And participation in the formation of the Mexican-American Party, La Raza Unida Party, founded in Denver, Colorado in 70, it was just before the 72 election, 70 or 71. His Yo Soy Joaquin poem identified with his Aztec heritage. And contended that he was a product and his people were a product of Spaniards raping and pillaging their indigenous ancestors. And then now the new plutocrats and oppressors were the Anglos, since the Mexican-American War had happened and the Stars and Stripes had spread over the far west. It's an interesting poem. And then the last one, Jose Angel Gutierrez, unionization of farm workers in California. No, that was Cesar Chavez and Dolores Huerta, right? And a priest named Fred Ross, who organized, unionized the farm workers. They engaged in strikes. They engaged in boycotts, public marches and parades, all kinds of different methods used, where they're going to put most of the major table growers of grapes, apricots, and other major fruit and vegetable commodities. They're going to force them to come to collective bargaining and recognize the United Farm Workers Union and to abide by certain protocols, like a minimum wage, workers' compensation, access to shade and water for the workers, etc., of what you see today for the bare minimal rights of migrant workers. And in his case, actually, it technically was for Mexican-American workers. He actually discouraged the use of immigrant workers because he said there were plenty of Mexican-Americans that were willing and able to do the job, and that just complicated things, allowed the table growers to divide and conquer between the immigrants and the native Mexican-American workers, and to be able to keep their wages low.
I have a question.
Sure.
So, isn't Jose Angel Gutierrez the one from Texas who is a civil rights worker?
Yes, sir. Yeah, he was really,
Okay.
yeah, when you Jaden, when you look in the because to be honest, I haven't read much on him. Much of what I've derived from him comes from the video. But if you do PBS video Chicano movement, it has the battle in the fields. And of course, that's going to focus on Cesar Chavez, right? Another one is something in the schools. And I think that's the one, because it talks a lot about Crystal City and organization and so forth. You're going to see a lot of Gutierrez in that one, mobilizing and registering to vote with the general elections of the school board and all that. And he's also in a third one that is about formulating. They have a third one just on making the Mexican-American Party, La Raza Unida Party. And while technically Rodolfo Gonzalez was elected the chairman of that convention, Gutierrez was right there in the thick of everything as well.
Okay, thank you.
Uh-huh. All right, so can I get a thumbs up? You guys feel pretty good about this? Thank you, Laura. Any questions at all? Well, I hope I even halfway did justice to this topic, because what a topic, huh? It's fascinating. All right.
I have one question.
Sure.
So on computer notes, it says that we have to do one argumentative section. Is that correct, or do we have to do two?
No, one is fine. Yeah, sometimes by the end of the year, I ask for two. So if something says two, it's from a previous semester.
Okay.
Yeah, with it being Thanksgiving week, I don't want to ask that of you. Of all weeks, I don't want to ask that of you this week.
Okay. Thank you.
You're welcome. All right. Sophia, nice to have you as well. All right. And so that's it, you guys. That's it for me. You guys have a great Thanksgiving. Have a great week. Make sure you work around Thanksgiving so that you can enjoy it. All right. And give yourself ample time around Thursday to submit this by Sunday night. That's right. You guys party and have fun and be safe.
Thank you, Derek. You too.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Appreciate you guys.
Thank you.
Thank you, Jaden. Take care.